the 19th of August, 1942. The English Channel, off the coast of Dieppe, France. In the pre-dawn chill, the sea is choked with steel. Men of the 2nd Canadian Infantry Division huddle in their landing craft, listening to the drone of engines and the sharp, distant crackle of machine gun fire. This is Operation Jubilee, the first major Allied attempt to seize a fortified port. It is meant to be a surgical strike, a test of German defences. Within hours, it will become a slaughterhouse, and the single most important lesson in failure of the Second World War. The boats grind to a halt, not on the pebble beach, but dozens of yards out, snagged on submerged sandbars or blocked by obstacles. The ramps drop, and the men plunge, not onto sand, but into cold, chest-deep water. They are immediately entangled in wire, weighed down by 60 pounds of gear, and systematically murdered. German machine gun nests, perfectly positioned in the cliffs and hotels overlooking the beach, enfilade the entire waterfront. The few tanks that make it ashore are immobilized, their tracks shattered by the chert pebbles. The boats that delivered them are burning, stranded targets. The men are trapped in a perfect kill box. By 10:50 a.m., the retreat is called. Of the nearly 5,000 Canadians who embarked, over 3,350 are killed, wounded, or captured. The Dieppe raid was not just a tragedy, it was a catastrophic failure of doctrine. It exposed a fatal flaw in Allied strategic planning. Lord Mountbatten, Chief of Combined Operations, summarised the brutal arithmetic. For every man who landed, one was killed, wounded, or captured. The lesson, paid for in blood, was horrifyingly simple. A direct, frontal assault on a fortified port was suicide. But if ports were impregnable, the only alternative was to land on open, undefended beaches. This presented an entirely new and, in 1942, an entirely unsolved logistical nightmare. This was the central, terrifying paradox of the Allied war effort. They possessed the industrial might to build a million-ton hammer, but lacked the most basic tool, a simple, effective, and expendable delivery system to swing it. They had armies, but no way to deploy them onto a hostile shore. The entire strategic concept of liberating Europe was stalled, not by a lack of will or manpower, but by 3 feet of shallow water and the lack of a viable landing craft. It was a problem that conventional military design had failed to solve, and one that would require a revolutionary and largely dismissed piece of technology, the Higginsboat. Before Dieppe, the concept of amphibious assault was viewed with deep skepticism by high command, particularly within the entrenched bureaucracy of the US Navy. The dominant military thinking, solidified in the 1,920 seconds and 30 seconds, was that modern coastal defences, long-range artillery, machine guns, and air power had rendered large-scale landings obsolete. The disastrous Gallipoli campaign of the First World War cast a long shadow, serving as the definitive text on how not times to conduct an invasion. Military journals and war colleges taught that the only way to seize a coastline was to first capture a major port, with its deep-water harbours and established piers, where large transport ships could dock and safely offload men and heavy equipment. This doctrine was materially enforced by the US Navy's Bureau of Construction and Repair, BUC&R, the powerful entity responsible for ship design. Their approach to the landing boat problem was conservative, slow, and utterly disconnected from the realities of an assault. Their primary pre-war design was the 30-foot landing craft, Personnel, LCP. It was a traditional deep-draft vessel, essentially a standard naval cutter lightly modified. It was slow, heavy, and its deep V-hull meant it could not get close to the beach. It would ground yards from the waterline, forcing soldiers to disembark just as they had at Dieppe by jumping over the high, wooden sides into deep, churning surf, completely exposed to enemy fire. It was a boat designed by bureaucrats who had never considered the terminal velocity of a bullet or the weight of waterlogged equipment. The BUC&R's failure was one of imagination. They were designing a transport, not an assault weapon. Their prototypes were built for stability in open water, not for the violent, suicidal transition from sea to land. They tinkered with steel hulls, which were heavy and prone to catastrophic damage from mines or obstacles. They focused on engine reliability for long voyages, not the explosive, short-term power needed to ram a beach and retract. In 1940, the Bureau tested a 30-foot boat that could carry 30 men. It drew 3 feet of water when loaded, making it a death trap for any beach with a gradual slope. Another prototype, the 36-foot landing craft Personnel, Large, or LCP, L, was slightly better, but still featured the fatal jump over the side design. It was a boat that protected its occupants right up until the most critical moment, at which point it offered them up for slaughter. This was the institutional wall of failure. The official, funded, and approved designs were tactical dead ends. The problem was not just the boat, it was the entire philosophy. The Allies were planning for a war of transport, while the Germans were building a fortress. The Atlantic Wall, Hitler's massive coastal defense system, was being constructed specifically to defeat a port-based invasion. The beaches, though mined and defended, were the only viable alternative. But landing on a beach required a craft that did not exist in the official inventory. It needed to be fast. It needed to carry a significant load of men or a vehicle. It needed to be expendable, built in the tens of thousands. And most importantly, it needed to operate in mere inches of water and deploy its cargo times directly onto dry sand. The US Navy, hidebound by tradition, had no answer. The solution would have to come from outside, from a man who knew nothing of naval bureaucracy, but everything about shallow water. The solution to the impossible problem was not found in the hallowed design halls of the Washington Navy Yard or the shipyards of Newport News. It was found in the mud, cypress stumps, and stifling humidity of the Louisiana bayou, and it was championed by a man who was everything the naval bureaucracy was not. Andrew Higgins was a force of nature. A Nebraska native who had moved to the South, he was a hard-drinking, profane, and incandescently brilliant Irishman, a brawler who was equally comfortable in a fistfight or a boardroom. He was a timber magnate, a boat builder, and an entrepreneur who saw rules as suggestions and failure as a personal insult. He built his business, Higgins Industries, on a simple premise: find a problem, solve it, and build it faster and cheaper than anyone else. He was, as one contemporary described him, a genius with a 7th-grade education and a vocabulary that would make a sailor blush. Higgins was not a naval architect. He was a practical engineer obsessed with the unique challenges of the Mississippi Delta. His clients were not admirals. They were trappers, rum runners, and oil prospectors. These men operated in a world of shallow drafts, shifting sandbars, submerged logs, and dense vegetation. They needed boats that could run in less than 2 feet of water, shrug off impacts with debris, and slide over mudflats without fouling their propellers. The traditional deep V hulls of coastal boats were useless here. Higgins, through relentless trial and error, developed a craft he called the Eureka boat. It was a masterpiece of functional design, born entirely from necessity. The Eureka's genius lay in its hull. Instead of a sharp keel, it featured a spoonbill bow that curved upward, allowing it to ride up and onto obstacles. Its bottom was nearly flat, giving it an incredibly shallow draft, but its most revolutionary feature was the propeller. Higgins recessed the propeller shaft into a semi-tunnel in the hull, protecting it from debris. He also engineered the shape of the hull to feed water times the propeller, ensuring it wouldn't cavitate or lose thrust in aerated, shallow water. The result was a boat that could hit a log, ramp over it, and keep going. It could run at high speed in 18 inches of water. It could turn on a dime. In the 1,930 seconds, it became the standard workboat for anyone who needed to conquer the bayou. Andrew Higgins had, without realizing it, solved the fundamental problem of amphibious assault: how to create a high-speed, protected propeller craft that could operate reliably in the unpredictable, debris-filled surf zone. Higgins himself was his own best salesman, a whirlwind of restless energy. He was notorious for his disdain of formal engineering. The slide rule boys in Washington, as he called them, don't know a damn thing about boats. He trusted intuition and brute force experimentation. There are famous, possibly apocryphal, stories of Higgins demonstrating his boats by personally driving them at full speed over floating logs, or even running them straight onto a beach to show a skeptical client. His philosophy was simple: if it doesn't work, break it and build it again. This relentless, results-driven iteration was the antithesis of the Navy's slow, committee-based design process. While the Bureau of Construction and Repair was spending months drafting blueprints for boats that didn't work, Higgins was building and breaking 3 new prototypes in a week. This unlikely genius remained unknown to the military high command until the United States Marine Corps, the service branch most obsessed with the problem of amphibious landings, went looking for a solution. The Marines, organizationally under the Navy but culturally distinct, were deeply dissatisfied with the Bureau's slow, heavy, and impractical LCPs. They were the ones who would have to ride those boats onto the beaches, and they knew they were death traps. In 1938, a junior Marine officer, Lieutenant Victor H. Brute Krulak, later a general, had returned from observing the Japanese in Shanghai, where he noted their use of small, ramp-bowed landing craft. His reports, and those of others, spurred the Marines to seek better designs. Their search led them to the landing craft personnel competitions. In 1941, the Marines tested Higgins's 36-foot Eureka boat against the Navy-approved designs from the Bureau. The results were not just clear, they were embarrassing. The Navy's boat, with its deep hull, couldn't get close to the shore. Higgins's Eureka, loaded with 30 Marines, ran right up onto the sand, unloaded its troops, still over the side at this point, and then, crucially, retracted itself off the beach with its own power. The Marines were ecstatic. Here was a boat that did exactly what they needed. Marine Corps Commandant, Major General Thomas Holcomb, wrote a scathing memorandum stating in no uncertain terms that the Higgins boat was superior in every regard. Higgins, sensing an opportunity, descended upon Washington, D.C. like a hurricane. He stormed the halls of the Navy Department, demanding meetings, shouting at admirals, and promoting his boat with evangelistic fervor. He had the solution. The end users, the Marines, were demanding it, but he had just run headlong into the most powerful obstacle in the U.S. Navy, the entrenched bureaucracy. The Bureau of Construction and Repair, led by the stern Admiral Samuel M. Robinson, was not amused. They had their own designs, their own budgets, and their own favored shipyards on the East Coast. They were not about to be told how to build boats by a loud-mouthed, uneducated civilian from New Orleans. The battle for the Higginsboat, the battle that would ultimately decide the fate of D-Day, would not be fought on a beach, but in the hostile corridors of power in Washington. When Andrew Higgins arrived in Washington, D.C., he was a human wrecking ball aimed at a fortress of naval tradition. He brought with him his 36-foot Eureka boat, a craft proven superior in every meaningful metric by the U.S. Marine Corps. The Marines, the men who would actually bleed on the beaches, were his champions. But in the rigid hierarchy of the Navy Department, the Marine Corps was a junior partner. The real power lay with the Bureau of Construction and Repair, BUC&R, and its chief, Rear Admiral Samuel M. Robinson. Robinson was the epitome of the naval establishment, methodical, conservative, and deeply skeptical of outsiders. Higgins, with his loud suits, louder voice, and utter contempt for protocol, was the ultimate outsider. The Bureau's resistance was immediate and formidable. It was not just a case of not invented here syndrome, it was a fundamental clash of philosophies. The BUC&R, in its official memoranda, raised a series of objections to the Eureka. First, it was made of wood, specifically plywood, a material Higgins had mastered. The Bureau, builders of steel battleships, viewed wood as archaic, weak, and unsuitable for the rigors of combat. They favored their own steel-hulled designs, ignoring the fact that steel was heavy, expensive, scarce, and, when hit by a mine or shell, tended to rip apart catastrophically. A wooden boat, as Higgins argued, could be holed and remain buoyant, and, critically, could be repaired in hours by a carpenter, not in weeks by a specialized shipyard welder. Second, Higgins Industries was a non-traditional supplier. The Bureau had long-standing, comfortable relationships with the established shipyards of the East Coast, such as Chris Craft and Palmer Scott. These were firms that understood naval contracting, followed procedures, and built boats to spec, even if the specifications were wrong. Higgins was a wild card, an unknown quantity based in New Orleans, far from the center of naval power. Third, and perhaps most damningly in the Bureau's eyes, Higgins's boat simply did not conform to their established requirements. The Bureau had spent years developing its own landing craft, and it was determined to see them built, regardless of their performance. They stubbornly pushed their own 36-foot LCPL, a design that, while bearing a superficial resemblance to the Eureka, was heavier, slower, and drew more water. The conflict reached a stalemate. The Marines wanted the Higgins boat. The Navy bureaucracy wanted its own boat. Higgins, never one to wait for permission, took his case public, lobbying Congress, shouting in admirals' offices, and making an incredible nuisance of himself. But the Eureka, for all its merits, still had the original Dieppe flaw. Troops had to jump over its high sides, exposing them to fire at the critical moment. The Marines knew this. They had seen reports from Lieutenant Victor Krulak about Japanese ramp-bowed boats in China. The problem was how to combine Higgins's high-speed, shallow-draft hull with the direct deployment capability of a bow ramp. The exact moment of creation is shrouded in battlefield legend, a story Higgins himself told many different ways. The most common version is that in 1941, Marine and Navy officials, frustrated with the over-the-side design, pressed Higgins for a solution. They showed him a sketch or mentioned the Japanese concept. Higgins, in a characteristic explosion of creative energy, reportedly grabbed a piece of cardboard, sketched a new design, and told his engineers to get to work. Another version has him receiving a frustrated phone call from a Marine officer, hanging up, and telling his chief designer, saw the bow off the Eureka and figure out how to hinge it. The truth is likely a rapid, iterative process, but the result was revolutionary. Higgins Industries took their existing, proven 36-foot Eureka hull, cut off the spoonbill bow, and fitted a wide, counterweighted, armored steel drop-down ramp. They called it the Landing Craft Personnel Ramped, or LCP. This was a major improvement, but the final evolution was yet to come. The initial ramp was narrow. The Marines, and increasingly the Army, realized they needed to land not just men, but vehicles. They needed to get a jeep, a 37mm anti-tank gun, or a full platoon of 36 men onto the beach in one go. Higgins responded almost immediately. He widened the boat, widened the ramp, and re-engineered the hull to handle the increased load. This was the final, perfected design. The Landing Craft, Vehicle, Personnel, or LCVP. It was the Higginsboat that would conquer the world. The Bureau of Construction and Repair was now backed into a corner. Their own designs were hopelessly outclassed. In head-to-head trials, the comparison was a farce. The Book and R's steel boat, when it ran aground, was stuck fast. Its propeller, unprotected, was vulnerable to debris. Higgins's LCVP, by contrast, would scream toward the beach at 9 knots, run its flat bow high onto the sand, drop its ramp, and discharge a full platoon in under 30 seconds. Then, its driver would throw the engine into reverse, and the boat's ingenious hull design would sluice water under its stern, allowing it to pull itself off the beach and return to the transport for another load. It could do this in as little as 18 inches of water. The evidence was undeniable. The Marines refused to accept anything else. The Army, planning massive invasions of North Africa, Sicily, and eventually France, saw the LCVP as the only tool for the job. Admiral Robinson and the Bureau, facing overwhelming pressure from the Joint Chiefs and reports of the boat's spectacular performance, were forced to capitulate. In a stunning reversal, the Navy not only approved the Higgins design but made it the standard for all amphibious landings. The backwoods boatbuilder from New Orleans, through sheer stubbornness and undeniable genius, had just defeated the most powerful bureaucracy in the U.S. military. He had won the contract. But now, with the world on fire and invasion timetables looming, he had to deliver on an impossible scale. Andrew Higgins had won the battle, but he had not won the war. He had forced the U.S. Navy to accept his boat. Now he had to build it, and the skeptics he had humiliated in the design phase simply shifted their attacks to a new front: production. The resistance in Washington was no longer overt. It was a quiet, insidious war of memoranda, inspections, and political maneuvering, a bureaucratic siege intended to prove that while Higgins might be a clever boat builder, he was incapable of meeting the industrial demands of a global conflict. His enemies were no longer just in Berlin, they were in the Navy Department and the U.S. Senate. The most persistent skepticism came from the very bureau he had defeated, now reorganized as the Bureau of Ships, BUSHIPS, but still led by the conservative Admiral Samuel M. Robinson. Having been forced to accept the LCVP design, BUSHIPS now expressed grave concerns about its construction. An avalanche of official correspondence began to flow, questioning every aspect of Higgins's operation. One line of attack was the plywood. A 1,942 internal BUSHIPS memorandum questioned the long-term viability of resin-bonded plywood hulls under sustained saltwater and combat conditions. The Bureau, steeped in the tradition of steel, simply did not trust wood. They predicted catastrophic failures: delamination under the tropical sun, rot in the humid jungles of the Pacific, and structural collapse from repeated beachings. Furthermore, BUSHIPS inspectors, sent to New Orleans, filed reports that were deeply critical of Higgins's production methods. To the organized, methodical mind of a naval engineer, the Higgins plant was pure chaos. Higgins had pioneered assembly line techniques for boat building, similar to what Henry Ford had done for cars. But it was a loud, frantic, and seemingly disorganized process. One inspector's report, later cited in congressional testimony, noted with alarm that Higgins's quality control seemed dangerously ad hoc and reliant on the personal judgment of foremen rather than established naval checklists. The Bureau was predicting that this backwoods factory would soon be turning out thousands of defective, unseaworthy craft, endangering the lives of American soldiers. This internal skepticism provided ammunition for a new and far more public threat: the United States Senate. In 1941, Senator Harry S. Truman of Missouri had launched the Senate Special Committee to investigate the National Defense Program, which would become famously known as the Truman Committee. Its mandate was to hunt down waste, fraud, and war profiteering. Higgins, with his massive, rapidly expanding, non-union operation and his larger-than-life personality, was a prime target. In 1943, the committee turned its full attention on Higgins Industries. The testimony was explosive. Senators, armed with the cautious reports from BUSHIPS, grilled Higgins relentlessly. They questioned his unconventional accounting. They attacked his labor practices. Higgins ran an open shop, employed women and African Americans in skilled positions, and paid them the same as white men, a revolutionary and, to some, politically dangerous practice in the segregated South. But most of all, they questioned the contracts. How had this one man, this single, unproven company, secured a virtual monopoly on the single most important boat of the war? The transcripts of these hearings reveal the deep-seated skepticism Higgins faced. Senator Truman, methodical and precise, demanded answers. Higgins, in true form, responded with bluster, fury, and facts. When questioned about his chaotic factory, he reportedly bellowed at the committee, "I don't care what you call it. We are building boats. We are building them faster than any of your high and mighty Navy yards, and they work. He presented figures showing his production rate dwarfing that of all his rivals combined. He was, in effect, being accused of building the boats too fast, too cheaply, and too unconventionally. This political fire was fanned by the very rivals Higgins had beaten. The established East Coast shipyards like Chris Craft and Palmer Scott were furious. They had lost the lucrative landing craft contracts to Higgins, and they used their considerable political influence to lobby against him. In letters to the Navy Department and in testimony to the Truman Committee, they argued that the government was making a grave mistake. They echoed the Bureau's concerns about plywood, but their real argument was economic. They accused the Navy of creating a Higgins monopoly that was un-American and dangerous to the war effort. What if, they argued, a single German bomb on the New Orleans plant could cripple the entire Allied invasion strategy? It was a potent argument that combined patriotic concern with naked self-interest. Andrew Higgins was now fighting a multi-front war. As he struggled to find the timber, the steel, and the manpower to build tens of thousands of boats, he was simultaneously fending off attacks from the Navy's own engineers, powerful U.S. senators, and the entire established boat-building industry. The skeptics were lined up against him, armed with spreadsheets, regulations, and political connections. They were all predicting, and in some cases actively working toward, his spectacular, catastrophic failure. Higgins, with his back to the wall, had only one possible response: to build. While the politicians and admirals waged their war of paper in Washington, Andrew Higgins was waging a war of production in New Orleans. His sprawling industrial complex on City Park Avenue and the Industrial Canal was not a traditional shipyard. It was a deafening, 24/7 vortex of frantic energy. The air was thick with the scream of power saws, the sharp scent of resin glue and diesel fumes, and the constant hammering of thousands of workers. It was, as one journalist described it, a shipyard gone mad, a place where boats were not so much built as they were extruded, launched before the paint was dry, sometimes even before the final blueprints were formally drawn. This was the crucible where the shallow draft revolution became an industrial reality. The weapon at the heart of this revolution was the finalized landing craft, vehicle, personnel, the LCVP. On paper, it was deceptively simple. It was 36 feet, 3 inches long, with a beam of 10 feet, 10 inches. But these dimensions masked a design of profound genius, where every component was optimized for a single, violent purpose: to bridge the last 100 yards of hostile water. The hull, the source of so much bureaucratic scorn, was its first innovation. It was not built of heavy, scarce steel, but of laminated plywood. Higgins, a master of woodcraft, layered planks of Honduran mahogany and spruce, bonding them with waterproof resin glues under immense pressure. The result was a hull that was incredibly light, astonishingly strong, and buoyant even when riddled with shrapnel holes. A steel boat, when breached, sinks. A plywood boat, when holed, could be plugged with rags, stuffed with life vests, and keep floating. More importantly, it could be repaired on a beach by a carpenter with a hammer and nails, not a specialized welder. Its second innovation was the ramp. It was a solid plate of high-tensile, armor-plated steel, wide enough to accommodate a jeep or a 36-man platoon standing shoulder to shoulder. It was not operated by complex hydraulics, which would inevitably fail in sand and salt water, but by a simple, manually operated cable and winch system. 2 men could drop it in seconds, turning the entire bow of the boat into a wide, stable bridge directly to the sand. But the LCVP's true secret, its revolutionary DNA, was hidden in the hull's shape. This was the Eureka design perfected. The bow was a flat spoonbill shape that, combined with the flat bottom, allowed the boat to run directly onto a beach and stop, not with a jarring crash, but with a smooth, grounding slide. The stern, however, housed the real magic, the recessed propeller tunnel. The drive shaft and the 24-inch bronze propeller were tucked up into a protective semi-tunnel within the hull. This protected them from sandbars, rocks, and the submerged debris like Rommel's asparagus that littered the landing zones. But this tunnel did more than just protect. Higgins had shaped the aft hull to hydrodynamically feed a solid, non-aerated stream of water directly into this tunnel, even in the churning, shallow surf. This prevented cavitation and gave the propeller a solid bite of water, which was the key to the boat's most critical maneuver, retracting. The ability to pull itself off the beach under its own power was what made the LCVP a reusable assault craft, and not just a one-way sacrificial barge. This design was not born whole. It was forged through Higgins's signature method of relentless, chaotic iteration. Higgins Industries was a massive, real-world laboratory. George Rapplier, a Higgins executive, described the process. We'd build a boat, test it in the morning, find a flaw, and by noon Mr. Higgins would have a crew sawing it apart. By evening, a new, modified version would be in the water for retesting. Higgins himself, often in a rumpled suit, would prowl the factory floor, grabbing a piece of chalk and sketching a design change directly onto the floor or the hull of a boat, shouting instructions to his foreman over the din. The heart of this new weapon was its engine. Higgins settled on the perfect motor, the Grey Marine 6-70, 1 diesel. It was a marinized version of the General Motors 6-71 truck engine, a 2-stroke, inline-6 workhorse that was reliable, powerful, and crucially, already in mass production. This 225 horsepower engine gave the 8-ton LCVP an incredible power-to-weight ratio. It could push a fully loaded boat carrying 8,100 pounds of cargo or 36 combat-equipped men through the water at a surprisingly fast 9 knots, about 10.4 miles per hour. This speed was a tactical advantage, minimizing the time the men spent floating in the kill zone. And in reverse, this same engine provided the raw, brute force torque needed to drag the grounded hull backward off the sand, freeing it to return to its transport ship for the next wave. The LCVP was not just a boat. It was a complete weapons system. It was cheap to build, simple to operate, and easy to repair. It solved the problem of the last 300 feet of war. It rendered the logic of fixed coastal defense, the logic of Dieppe and the Atlantic Wall, obsolete. If you could land a full division, with its vehicles and anti-tank guns, anywhere on an open, undefended beach, then the enemy's entire defensive strategy, based on protecting ports, was nullified. The shallow draft revolution was complete. The boat that could win the war now existed, and it was rolling off Andrew Higgins's chaotic assembly lines, ready to go to war. The LCVP was no longer a theory. By late 1942, it was rolling off Higgins's assembly lines by the hundreds, a mass-produced weapon arriving at new, sprawling amphibious training centers that had sprung up almost overnight, at places like Camp Lejeune in North Carolina, Camp Pendleton in California, and Fort Pierce in Florida. A new kind of war was being invented. There was no doctrine for this. No one in the US, as military, had ever conducted a large-scale, opposed landing with this type of craft. The boat worked, but the tactics had to be invented from scratch, and the men who had to invent them were the first, terrified testers. The primary testers were two distinct groups, the US Navy coxswains who drove the boats, and the Army GIs and Marines who were the cargo. For the coxswains, many of whom were young Coast Guard or Navy reservists who had been fishermen or delivery drivers months earlier, the LCVP was a beast. It was, as one put it, a 36-foot plywood box with a diesel engine that hated you. The training was a brutal process of trial and error. Their first foe was not the Germans, but the surf. In his oral history, Navy coxswain Howard van der Beek, who trained at Fort Pierce, described the raw fear of the first runs. The noise was incredible, he said. That big grey marine diesel was right behind you, deafening. You couldn't hear the instructors, you just felt the vibration and the fumes. Their greatest terror was broaching. The LCVP's flat bottom, so brilliant for beaching, made it a nightmare in a heavy swell. If a coxswain misjudged a wave, the boat would be instantly thrown sideways, parallel to the beach, a sitting duck. This was a broach. The next wave would catch it, roll it, and capsize it, dumping its entire payload of 36 men and their equipment into the churning water. They drilled it into us, another coxswain's account recalled. You broach, you kill everyone. You keep your bow pointed at the beach no matter what. You surf the wave in, gunning the engine at the right moment. God help you if you got it wrong. These young men, often barely 20 years old, were learning to be part surfboarder, part tank driver, in a craft that was unforgiving of the slightest mistake. If the experience was terrifying for the coxswains, it was pure, unadulterated misery for the cargo. The GIs and Marines, loaded in for practice runs, discovered the second great flaw of the Higginsboat. It was, quite possibly, the most seasickness-inducing vessel ever created. The flat bottom that slid over sandbars also caused it to roll violently in any water that wasn't glass calm. Men were packed in, standing shoulder to shoulder, unable to sit down. Eugene B. Sledge, in his famous memoir With the Old Breed, described the experience in the Pacific, a universal sentiment shared by the men in the Atlantic. We were packed in the boat so tightly, the waves rolled us from side to side. The stench of diesel fuel, exhaust fumes, and vomit from seasick men was nauseating. It was a miserable ride. The men were in a floating steel and wood box. They could see nothing but the grey sky above and the back of the helmet in front of them. Their only view was the cold, impassive steel of the bow ramp, the object that was both their shield and the door to their potential doom. Training accounts from the Army's 1st Infantry Division, preparing for North Africa, are filled with this sensory dread. The men would be loaded, the boats would circle for hours in mock holding patterns, and the entire time the men were trapped with the diesel fumes, the vomit of their comrades, and the agonizing, stomach-churning roll. They were being conditioned not just for the landing, but for the sheer physical and psychological misery of the transit. Then came the critical moment, the landing itself. The coxswains, fighting the surf, would aim for their designated patch of sand and gun the engine one last time. The boat would surge forward, and then, with a sudden bone-jarring lurch, it would grind to a halt, its bow driven deep into the sand. This was the signal. Multiple primary accounts describe this exact sequence. The boat grounds, the coxswain, perched in the stern, screams over the engine, ramp down. 2 sailors would frantically work the winches, and with a grinding screech of metal, the steel ramp would crash down into the surf. Clear the ramp, the coxswain would bellow. This was the moment of truth. For the GIs, this was the explosion. After an hour of nauseated paralysis, they were propelled into violent action. The first men would hit the ramp, often plunging into knee-deep or waist-deep water if the coxswain had grounded on a sandbar. They had seconds to get out. The boat was the single biggest target on the beach. You did not run down the ramp, one veteran of the 1st Division stated. You fell. You were pushed. You just got out. Any way you could. The man in front of you fell. You ran over him. The man behind you fell. He ran over you. It was just a desperate scramble to get off the boat and onto the sand. The training was brutal, chaotic, and wet. Men drowned in training. Boats were lost. But the lessons were learned. The Higginsboat was not a comfortable ride. It was not elegant. It was a violent, noisy, bucking, nauseating instrument of war. But the first testers, the terrified coxswains and the seasick GIs, had proven that it worked. It did the one impossible thing it was designed to do. It could take 36 men from a ship 12 miles offshore, carry them through the surf, and vomit them onto a hostile beach in under 30 seconds. The weapon was viable, and in November 1942, it was about to get its first trial by fire. The 9th of July 1943, the Mediterranean Sea. A black void under a moonless sky. A massive armada, the largest in human history to that point, plows through the darkness toward the southern coast of Sicily. This is Operation Husky, the Allied invasion of Italy, and it is the final, terrifying examination for the Higginsboat. The limited, semi-opposed landings in North Africa during Operation Torch had been a preliminary test. This was the full-scale trial by fire. Over 2,500 ships carried 160,000 men, 14,000 vehicles, and 600 tanks. The entire plan, the fate of General George S. Patton's 7th Army and the liberation of Italy, rested not on the battleships, but on a few thousand 36-foot plywood boats. If they failed, the army would be stranded at sea, picked apart by Axis defenders. Sicily was the test that would validate the entire shallow draft revolution, or see it drown in the surf. The strategic scale of Husky was what made the LCVP so critical. This was not merely an assault, it was the transplantation of a modern, mechanized army onto a hostile continent. The plan required landing not just the initial waves of infantry, but a relentless, non-stop conveyor belt of artillery, jeeps, ammunition, and supplies. The German and Italian defenders, led by the formidable Albert Kesselring, knew they could not stop the landing itself. Their strategy was to defeat the invasion on the beach by launching a rapid, violent counterattack with panzer divisions, annihilating the Allied infantry before they could be reinforced by heavy weapons. The entire battle would be a race. Could the Higgins boats land Patton's men and material faster than Kesselring's tanks could arrive to destroy them? Nature itself seemed to conspire against the invasion. As the fleet approached the coast, a near gale, a mistral wind, blew up, churning the Mediterranean into a chaos of 12-foot waves. On the transport ships, the men of the 1st Infantry Division, the big red one, were already suffering. The LCVPs, stacked on the transports, were being thrashed by the wind. The order came: load the boats. In the pitching darkness, men had to climb down wet, treacherous cargo nets, burdened with 60 pounds of gear, and time their drop into the LCVPs as the small boats crashed violently against the steel hull of the mothership. Many men were injured before a shot was even fired, their hands or legs crushed between the two vessels. For the Navy coxswains of the 8th Amphibious Force, this was the nightmare scenario from training made real. Their after-action reports are a litany of terror and exhaustion. The coxswain, blinded by salt spray and darkness, was fighting a three-way war against the enemy, the sea, and his own boat. His first task was just to find his assigned beach, marked only by a single, shaded signal light from a Pathfinder submarine. All the while the boat was rolling, pitching, and threatening to broach in the heavy seas. One coxswain from the attack transport USS Times, Charles Carroll Times, wrote, "The waves were so high, half the time our propeller was out of the water, screaming. You'd lose sight of the boat next to you, then you'd be looking down on it from the crest of a wave." Then came the German response. As the first waves approached the beach at Gela, flares burst overhead, illuminating the armada. Italian and German shore batteries opened up. Geysers of water from artillery shells erupted among the small boats. The coxswains now had to navigate through the surf, under fire, in the dark. In his oral history, Navy Coxswain A.D. Don Kane described the landing. "You're heading in, and the beach is just a black line. Then the tracers start coming out at you, looking like red basketballs. You just duck your head behind that little steel plate and pray. I hit the beach, dropped the ramp, and just screamed. I don't even know what I screamed. Go, go, go." The men, they just poured out into the darkness. For the soldiers of the 1st Division, the ride-in was an agonizing 12 miles of pure misery. After the terror of the cargo nets, they were packed into the boat, soaked to the bone, and violently ill. In his acclaimed account, Sicily, the day of the landing, historian Rick Atkinson pieced together the experience from hundreds of interviews. The GIs were concave with nausea, the boat a wallowing, stinking tub filled with diesel fumes and vomit. Then, the grinding halt on the sand. The ramp crashed down. The men plunged out, not onto the dry sand of their Florida training, but into a treacherous, neck-deep surf created by the high winds and offshore sandbars. They were instantly scattered, their weapons fouled with water, their units broken apart, but the boat had done its job, and it was already returning for more. This was the miracle of the Higginsboat. Despite the chaos, the wind, and the enemy fire, the system worked. As the sun rose on July 10, the defenders saw not a failed, scattered landing, but an unstoppable tide. The LCVPs were a conveyor belt, as Patton called it. They hit the beach, dropped their loads, retracted, and returned. When the Hermann Göring Panzer Division launched its ferocious counterattack on the Gala beachhead, the GIs of the 1st Division were just barely holding on. The panzers were pushing them back to the water's edge. The victory was decided by the LCVPs. Under direct artillery and tank fire, the coxswains, in a display of almost suicidal bravery, never stopped. They drove their plywood boats times through times the artillery barrage, landing artillery, anti-tank guns, and fresh infantry directly into the thick of the fight. The tanks were stopped, literally yards from the beach, by guns that had been on a transport ship an hour earlier. Operation Husky was a brutal, costly, and resounding success. The shallow draft doctrine had been proven. The Higginsboat had passed its final exam. It had demonstrated the ability to land a modern, mechanized army on a hostile, defended, and weather-beaten coast, and to sustain it in a race against an armoured counterattack. The impossible problem of Dieppe had been solved. The lessons learned in the surf off Sicily, paid for in blood and plywood, would now form the final, definitive blueprint for the greatest invasion of all, D-Day. The success of Operation Husky was a validation, but it was also a death warrant. The landings in Sicily, while successful, had consumed hundreds of landing craft. Now, with the invasions of mainland Italy, the island-hopping campaign in the Pacific, and the colossal, continent-shifting invasion of France, Operation Overlord, all on the drawing board, the demand for LCVPs became, quite literally, infinite. The entire Allied grand strategy, the very concept of a two-front war, now rested on the industrial capacity of one man in New Orleans, whom the Washington establishment had tried to shut down. The skeptics who had predicted Higgins's failure were about to be buried under an avalanche of plywood and steel. If the LCVP was a revolutionary weapon, the Higgins Industries plant was the industrial miracle that armed the revolution. The numbers are so staggering they defy comprehension. At its peak in 1943 to 1944, Higgins Industries was not just a company, it was a sovereign industrial state. It comprised 8 separate plants covering 110 acres in New Orleans, employing over 30,000 workers. The U.S. government, in a complete reversal, had poured over $60 million, nearly $1 billion in modern currency, into this operation, making it one of the largest manufacturing facilities on Earth. And from this sprawling, chaotic complex came a torrent of production. Higgins was not just building boats, he was building a new navy, from scratch, every single month. The statistics became a statistical hammer in their own right. At its zenith, Higgins Industries was producing over 700 LCVPs times per month *. This meant a new combat-ready landing craft was rolling off the assembly line every 60 minutes. But that was not all. Higgins also held the contracts for the larger 50-foot landing craft, mechanized LCM, which could carry a medium tank, and dozens of other specialized craft, including patrol boats and anti-submarine vessels. By the end of the war, Higgins Industries would build 20,094 boats, the vast majority of them the LCVP that the Bureau of Ships had so thoroughly dismissed. It was an industrial achievement that dwarfed the output of all other Allied boat builders combined. How did he do it? He broke every rule of traditional shipbuilding. As journalists like Raymond Moley, who toured the Miracle Plant, noted, Higgins did not build boats, he times manufactured times them. He applied Henry Ford's assembly line techniques to a product far more complex than a Model T. At the main City Park Avenue plant, the process was a symphony of organized chaos. Hulls were built upside down on a moving assembly line, allowing workers to attach the complex running gear and planking with maximum efficiency. As they moved down the line, the hulls were flipped, and the grey marine diesel engines, pre-assembled in another building, were dropped in by crane. The steel ramps, fabricated at another plant, arrived on trucks, were bolted on, and the finished boat was shunted out the door, often directly into the New Orleans Industrial Canal for immediate water testing. This industrial machine was powered by a workforce that was just as revolutionary as the boat itself. Andrew Higgins, the gruff, anti-Washington brawler, was also a profound social progressive in the context of his time. Facing a massive labor shortage, he ignored the racist and sexist hiring practices of the segregated South. He hired women, African Americans, the elderly, and the physically handicapped, and, in a move that made him a pariah to the established, segregated business community of Louisiana, he paid them all equal wages for equal work. At its peak, his workforce was 42% African American. Women, who had never been allowed in shipyards, worked as welders, riveters, and carpenters. He called them his soldiers of production. This wasn't altruism, it was pragmatism. Higgins cared about one thing: results. He said, "I don't care if a man is black or white. If he can do the job, he's the man for the job." This meritocratic, integrated workforce was the human engine that outproduced the Axis. Higgins, now vindicated, reveled in his victory over the Washington skeptics. He used the press and his continued testimony to the Truman Committee as a bully pulpit. When Senator Truman, who had, by this point, become a grudging admirer, questioned him about his unconventional methods, Higgins was defiant. "We are in a war," he bellowed, "and we are winning it with boats that your experts said couldn't be built, with workers your planners said couldn't be hired." He took particular aim at his corporate rivals, the East Coast shipyards that had lobbied against him. He famously boasted to a reporter, "They said I couldn't build 'em. Well, I'm building 'em. I'm building 'em faster than they can count 'em. And every one of 'em is a nail in Hitler's coffin." The industrial hammer that Higgins had forged in New Orleans was now the central pillar of Allied logistics. He had proven the skeptics catastrophically wrong. He had not just built a boat, he had created an industrial-scale weapon of war. This unstoppable tide of plywood and diesel, flowing from the Gulf of Mexico to every theatre of the war, was what made the final, great invasion of Europe numerically possible. The stage was set, the army had been trained, the boat had been proven in combat, and now the arsenal was full. The only thing left was the target. It was not a boat. For the millions of Allied soldiers who rode one, the Higginsboat was a floating purgatory, a 36-foot plywood crucible designed to test the limits of human endurance times before the battle even began. The experience of the run-in, whether in the freezing English Channel, the warm Mediterranean, or the turquoise waters of a Pacific atoll, was a universal, shared trauma. It was a 10 to 30-minute symphony of sensory overload, a prelude to hell that became the defining memory of the amphibious war. The experience began with the noise. The grey marine 6-71 diesel engine, located in the stern, was not muffled for comfort. It was a raw, unmuffled 225 horsepower roar that vibrated through the hull and into the very bones of the men standing beside it. In his famous dispatches, war correspondent Ernie Pyle, who rode with the men, described it as a deafening, frightening noise that made all communication, save for screamed commands, impossible. This roar was the soundtrack to the invasion, a constant, nerve-shredding thrum that built the tension to an unbearable pitch. Then came the smell. The air inside the crowded well deck was a toxic, gagging cocktail. There was the sharp, acrid scent of diesel exhaust, which billowed from the engine and hung thick in the air. This mixed with the smell of salt spray and, almost universally, the stench of vomit. The flat-bottomed hull that made the LCVP a brilliant beaching craft also made it a horrific vessel in a swell. It did not cut through waves. It slapped them, rolling and pitching with a violent, unpredictable motion. Men who had never been seasick in their lives found themselves retching uncontrollably, adding to the filth that sloshed around their boots. Marine Eugene Sledge, in his memoir With the Old Breed, recalled the nauseating stench of diesel, exhaust fumes, and the vomit of seasick men, a misery that preceded the terror of the beach at Peleliu. They were packed in, 36 men, shoulder to shoulder, knee to back, unable to sit, unable to move. They were a single, compressed mass of humanity, weighed down by 60 to 80 pounds of ammunition, weapons, and gear. They were completely blind. The high, plywood and steel gunwales of the boat meant they could see nothing but the patch of grey sky above them and the helmet of the man in front. They had no idea where they were, how close they were to the beach, or what awaited them. They were, as one soldier from the 29th Infantry Division described it, just cargo. Scared, seasick cargo. The psychological focal point of this entire experience was the steel plate in front of them, the bow ramp. For the duration of the ride, this ramp was their shield. It was the only thing protecting them from the shrapnel, artillery, and machine gun fire that began to rain down as they entered the kill zone. The men in the front ranks would stare at this plate, listening to the times tink-tink, ping times of bullets and shrapnel impacting the other side, just inches from their faces. It was a flimsy, temporary, and yet desperately needed feeling of safety. But every man knew that in one horrifying instant, this shield would become the exit. The ramp was a doorway, and on the other side was a wall of German or Japanese fire, SLA. Marshall, in his definitive interviews with the men of D-Day, the first wave, captured this terrible psychology. The ramp, he noted, was a fatal funnel. It would drop, and every machine gunner on the beach, who had zeroed in on that exact spot, would unleash a torrent of fire into the 10-foot-wide opening. The men in the front, the first 6 or 8, were statistically doomed. They knew it. Every man behind them knew it. They were trapped, staring at the door, waiting for it to open and for the slaughter to begin. For the coxswain, perched in his tiny, armoured cockpit in the stern, the experience was one of almost unbearable responsibility. He was the only man who could see. He had to navigate through the chaos of other boats, submerged obstacles, and the geysers of water from artillery shells. He was fighting the surf, desperately trying to keep from broaching, all while a German machine gunner tried to put a bullet through his viewing slit. Navy coxswain Howard van der Beek, recalling his runs into Omaha Beach, spoke of the terrible burden. You're trying to find a clear spot, and you see the men from the first wave, just floating in the water, face down. And you know you've got to drop these 36 men into that same meat grinder. The coxswain's final act was to ground the boat, screaming, "Ramp down! Clear the ramp!" He would then watch in horror as the men he had safely delivered just seconds before were annihilated. Oral histories from coxswains are filled with this shared trauma, the sight of the ramp dropping, the men charging out, and the immediate, sickening mowing down of the first soldiers, who would fall back onto the ramp itself, creating a clog of bodies. The ramp became a bridge of the dead. The Higginsboat was not a vessel of deliverance. It was a 10-minute, 36-man prelude to combat that was as psychologically scarring as the battle itself. It was a shared crucible of noise, nausea, and suffocating tension, all focused on a single steel ramp. It was the terrible chariot that carried a generation into the fire. The 6th of June 1944, 6:30 a.m., the English Channel, off the coast of Normandy, H-hour. For the men of the 1st and 29th Infantry Divisions, huddled in the pitching, wallowing LCVPs, the world had been reduced to a deafening, terrifying roar. For hours, the awesome thunder of the naval bombardment, thousands of shells from battleships like the USS Times, Texas Times, and Times Arkansas Times, had torn the sky apart, a man-made volcano erupting over their heads. The sea was a grey, choppy, windswept chaos, clogged with an armada of 5,000 ships. The air, thick with cordite and diesel fumes, was cold, and through the smoke they could just make out their objective, a 4-mile stretch of sand and towering bluffs, code, named Omaha. This was it. The impossible problem was being met by the impossible boat. This was the day the Higginsboat had been built for. The run-in was the familiar misery, magnified to an industrial scale. The seas, rougher than anticipated, had soaked every man to the skin and turned the LCVPs into heaving, vomit-filled buckets. But as they neared the shore, a new, horrifying realization dawned. The pre-invasion bombardment, so awesome to hear, had been tragically ineffective. The cloud cover and smoke had caused the bombers to drop their payloads too far inland. The naval shells, fired from a distance to avoid the rough seas, had largely missed the German fortifications embedded in the bluffs. The enemy was untouched, waiting, and looking directly at them. The men in the boats were heading into a perfectly preserved, pre-sighted kill box. The experience of Company A, 116th Infantry, 29th Division, became the definitive, horrifying story of the Higginsboat's terrible purpose. Their LCVPs were among the very first to hit the beach, grounding on a sandbar in the dog-green sector. Directly in front of the Vierville-sur-Mer draw an exit the Germans had defended with interlocking nests of MG-42 machine guns. In his landmark study, The First Wave, historian SLA, Marshall, who interviewed the survivors on the beach just days later, recorded the precise, catastrophic moment. The coxswains, under intense fire, grounded their boats, the ramps dropped, and the Higginsboat, the perfect delivery system, delivered its 36-man cargo directly into the fatal funnel of an unsuppressed, waiting enemy. Private George Bedford, a soldier in that wave, recounted the moment. The ramp went down, and the men in front, weighed down by their gear, began to move. In that same instant, 3 or 4 MG-42 seconds opened up, pouring thousands of rounds per minute into the 1 0-foot-wide opening. The men at the front didn't just die, they were vaporized, cut in half before they could even take a step. They fell backward, onto their comrades, creating a bridge of the dead that clogged the exit. The men behind them, in a panic, tried to climb over the sides of the boat, only to be shot as they exposed themselves. Within seconds, the boat, which had been a shield, was now a coffin, a floating death trap, as one survivor called it. Company A, 116th Infantry, ceased to exist in the first 10 minutes of the landing. 90% of its men were killed or wounded before they had even left the ramp. This scene was repeated, with varying degrees of horror, all across Omaha Beach. The Higginsboat's brilliant design was, in this one specific, terrible instance, a liability. It funneled the men into a single, predictable exit point, a target the German gunners could not miss. The coxswains, for their part, were living a nightmare of impossible choices. Their oral histories, collected by the U.S. Naval Institute, are a testament to their bravery and their burden. They were 19, 20-year-old men, trying to pilot a bucking, flat-bottomed boat through a lethal forest of submerged obstacles, the Rommel's asparagus poles and hedgehog steel traps, designed specifically to gut their craft. Coxswain Howard van der Beek, in his accounts, described seeing the boats in the waves ahead of him simply evaporate, hit by direct artillery fire. He saw the beach not as a landing zone but as a red line of bodies and burning equipment. His orders were to land his men. But where? Drop them on a sandbar, and they would drown in the deep water, as many did. Try to push through, and he risked hitting a mine that would kill everyone, including himself. He pushed in, grounded the boat, took a burst of machine gun fire against his armoured cockpit, and dropped the ramp. He watched his men pour out into the meat grinder. I dropped the ramp, and they just disappeared, mowed down, he recalled. You see your men fall, and you've just delivered them to it. You can't do anything. You just throw it in reverse and pray to God you get off the beach. Many didn't. LCVPs were left burning on the sand, their coxswains dead at the wheel, but the horror of the first wave was only half the story. The battle for Omaha was ultimately won, not by tactics, but by logistics and sheer, stubborn courage. And the linchpin of that logistical victory was the Higginsboat. While the first waves were being annihilated, the next waves were already on their way. And the next. And the next. The German defenders, who had just repulsed a regimental-sized assault, looked up and saw, to their disbelief, an endless, horizon-to-horizon swarm of times more times LCVPs, churning relentlessly toward them. This was the Higgins industrial hammer in action. It was a conveyor belt of men and steel. The German defences, though brilliant, were finite. They had a limited amount of ammunition. Their machine gun barrels overheated. They could not kill times everyone asterisk. General Omar Bradley, watching from the flagship USS Times Augusta asterisk, at one point considered evacuating the beach, believing the landing a catastrophic failure. But the LCVPs, and the men who rowed them, never stopped. Pinned down, leaderless men, who had survived the ramp drop, began to form small ad hoc groups. They found a gap, a momentary lull in the firing, and began to climb the bluffs. And as they did, the Higgins boats, now navigating a beach choked with the dead and the wreckage of their sister ships, continued to land, bringing in the engineers, the mortars, the ammunition, and the reinforcements that would finally, inch by bloody inch, break the stalemate. Omaha Beach was the Higgins boat's most terrible and its most crucial test. It was the instrument of a near-perfect slaughter, delivering men with lethal efficiency into a perfect hell. But it was also, and simultaneously, the only tool of its salvation. The boat's simple, expendable, and endlessly numerous design was the only thing that allowed the Allies to reinforce failure on an industrial scale, to feed men into the fire until the fire itself was finally extinguished by a flood of sheer, unyielding mass. The boat that won the war did so, at Omaha, as a vessel of pure, unadulterated sacrifice. The guns fell silent in 1945. The world, shattered and exhausted, began the immense task of counting its dead and assessing how, exactly, the most destructive conflict in human history had been won. In the grand accounting of the war, the heroes were clear: the infantryman, the pilot, the sailor. The winning weapons were obvious: the B-17 Flying Fortress, the P-50, one Mustang, the M4 Sherman tank, and the awesome, terrible finality of the atomic bomb. But as the architects of the victory, the generals and admirals wrote their memoirs and conducted their post-mortems, a different, far more humble piece of equipment emerged as, arguably, the single most important. It was a 36-foot plywood box built by a foul-mouthed brawler in New Orleans. The most definitive and startling assessment came from the man who had commanded the entire Allied effort in Europe, Supreme Allied Commander General Dwight D. Eisenhower. In a 1945 interview, Eisenhower was unequivocal. He did not credit the tank, the plane, or the bomb. He credited the boat. Andrew Higgins, Eisenhower stated flatly, is the man who won the war for us. If Higgins had not designed and built those LCVPs, we never could have landed over an open beach. The entire strategy of the war would have been different. This was not hyperbole. It was a cold, strategic calculation. Eisenhower, the master logistician, understood what the public did not. The entire Allied grand strategy, the very concept of defeating Germany by invading France, rested on the ability to solve the impossible problem of Dieppe. The German defence, codified in Field Marshal Erwin Rommel's Atlantic Wall, was a fortress built on a single medieval assumption: that a modern, mechanized army needed a deep water port to land. The Germans, therefore, had spent billions of Reichsmarks and millions of tons of concrete transforming every major French port, Cherbourg, Calais, Le Havre, into an impregnable bastion. The open beaches, while defended, were considered a secondary front, impossible for the Allies to use as a primary invasion point. The Higgins boat rendered this entire colossal defensive strategy obsolete. It was the key that unlocked the side door. Because of the LCVP, Eisenhower did not need times to take a port. He could land his armies directly onto the open, sandy beaches of Normandy. He could bypass the fortresses and create his own port out of thin air, which is precisely what the Mulberry harbours were, themselves serviced by a constant stream of LCVPs and other landing craft, shuttling goods from ship to shore. Hitler, in his post-invasion rages, and Rommel, in his despairing reports, both realized their catastrophic miscalculation too late. The Allies had a tool that allowed them to land times anywhere *. The Atlantic Wall, for all its menace, had been strategically outflanked before the first shot was fired, not by a flanking maneuver, but by a piece of technology. And this was only half the story. If the Higginsboat was the key to Europe, it was the entire master keyring for the war in the Pacific, the US. Navy's campaign against the Japanese Empire was a war of thousands of islands, atolls, and coral reefs. Here, the enemy was not just the Japanese, but the geography itself. In the 1943 invasion of Tarawa, the Marines faced a new kind of hell. A treacherous, submerged coral reef, hundreds of yards from the beach, stopped the US Navy's standard landing craft cold. The deep draft boats, including the first LCVPs, grounded on the reef, forcing the Marines to wade ashore, chest deep in water, for nearly half a mile under withering machine gun fire. It was a slaughter, but the Higgins-designed family of craft was the only solution. The LCVPs, with their shallow draft, could get closer than any other boat, and their larger cousins, the amphibian tractors, LVT, or Amtraks, which were also built by Higgins and others, were designed to crawl times over times those reefs. In the island-hopping campaigns that followed at Peleliu, Iwo Jima, and Okinawa, the LCVP was the indispensable workhorse. It was the only vessel capable of navigating the treacherous, reef-strewn, and unpredictable waters of the atolls to ferry the men, ammunition, and supplies that sustained the fight. Without the LCVP and its derivatives, the Pacific War, a war defined by amphibious assault, would have been logistically impossible. The final numbers tell the story. Over 20,000 Higgins-designed LCVPs and related craft were built. This single design, initially rejected by the US Navy bureaucracy, became the standard landing craft for times every times major Allied amphibious operation of the entire global conflict. Every American and British soldier who landed in North Africa, Sicily, Italy, Normandy, and southern France, and every Marine who stormed a beach in the Pacific, did so from a Higgins boat. This was its ultimate strategic impact. It was the physical manifestation of America's industrial-scale, problem-solving, brute force approach to logistics. It was not a glorious weapon. It was not fast. It was not beautiful. And for the men who rode it, it was a vessel of profound misery and terror. But it was the times, winning times, weapon. It was the tool that solved the single most difficult strategic puzzle of the 20th century. Eisenhower was right. The man who had been laughed out of Washington had, in the end, built the boat that won the war. The victory of the Higginsboat seems, in retrospect, to have been total and absolute. Eisenhower's words, "the boat that won the war," have cemented the LCVP's legacy as the singular, definitive tool of amphibious assault. But the bureaucratic war in Washington, the bitter internal conflict between Andrew Higgins and the Navy's Bureau of Ships, did not end with the LCVP's adoption. In a final, almost absurd chapter of institutional resistance, Ships, even after acknowledging the LCVP's superiority, continued to fund, procure, and build thousands of its own inferior, rival boats. The war for the beaches was won, but the war in the procurement offices had a bitter, wasteful, and largely forgotten postscript. The forgotten rival was the boat the Bureau had wanted all along. It was the direct descendant of their original, failed prototypes. Officially designated the Landing Craft Personnel, Large, or LCP-L. It was a 36-foot boat, just like the LCVP. But there, the similarities ended. This was the Bureau's design, built by the established East Coast shipyards that Higgins had politically infuriated firms like Chris Craft and Palmer Scott. It was, in every meaningful way, the anti-Higginsboat. It was heavy, often built of steel or a much thicker, more conventional wooden hull. It lacked the shallow draft spoonbill bow, but its most critical and most damning feature was its lack of a ramp. It was a jump over the side boat. This was the design the Bureau had favoured in 1941, and it was the design they stubbornly refused to abandon. Even as tens of thousands of LCVPs rolled out of New Orleans, bushships continued to place massive orders for the LCP-L. Their reasoning was a perfect case study in bureaucratic inertia and political manoeuvring. First, there was the legitimate, if overstated, fear of the Higgins monopoly. As the Truman Committee had highlighted, relying on a single, volatile man and a single city for the most critical boat of the war was a strategic risk. What if a U-boat campaign in the Gulf of Mexico, or a single, well-placed German saboteur, managed to destroy the Higgins plant? Diversifying the supply chain by using the East Coast yards was a prudent, if flawed, hedge. Second, there was the institutional preference for steel. The battleship admirals at bushships simply trusted steel more than plywood, despite all combat evidence to the contrary. They continued to believe, against all data from Sicily and Omaha, that a steel hull was inherently more durable and seaworthy than Higgins's laminated wood. Third, and most cynically, there was the immense political pressure from the established shipbuilding lobby. Chris Craft and Palmer Scott had powerful allies in Congress, and they were not about to let this one upstart from New Orleans take all times the money. The result was a two-boat navy. The LCVPs, the A-team boat, went to the most critical assault operations, but thousands of the inferior LCP-Ls were built and flooded the amphibious fleets used for secondary landings, logistical support, and, in some cases, combat. The men who had to use both crafts knew the difference immediately. Memoirs and oral histories from sailors and GIs are filled with this comparison. The LCVP was the hot rod, fast, nimble, and functional. The LCP-L, by contrast, was known as the U-boat or the pig. It was slower, heavier, and drew more water. One Navy coxswain, in an oral history for the U.S. Naval Institute, recalled his frustration. You'd get assigned an LCP-L for a run, and you'd just curse. It was a tub. It handled like a log, and it couldn't get in as close to the beach. You'd ground it 50 yards out, and the GIs would look at you, and you'd just have to shrug. For the soldiers, the difference was between a difficult, dangerous assault and a suicidal one. The ramp on the LCVP was a funnel, yes, but it was a fast times funnel. It got 36 men out in 30 seconds. The LCP-L was a return to the nightmare of Dieppe. It had no ramp. Men had to clamber, one by one, over its high, wooden or steel gunwales. They were completely exposed at the most critical moment, silhouetted against the sky, an easy target for any sniper or machine gunner. And they didn't land on the beach. They plunged into deep, churning surf, weighed down by their equipment, often yards from shore. It was a slow, agonizing, and incredibly dangerous way to disembark. In any opposed landing where both boats were used, the LCP-Ls almost invariably suffered higher casualties. This dual procurement program was the final, wasteful echo of the Bureau's bureaucratic war against Andrew Higgins. It was a massive expenditure of scarce steel, engines, and industrial capacity to build a boat that was already obsolete, a boat that had failed its trials years earlier. It was a decision based on institutional pride, political connections, and a stubborn refusal to admit that a backwoods boatbuilder had been right all along. This forgotten rival, the boat the Navy establishment insisted on building, serves as the ultimate proof of Higgins's genius. His design was so revolutionary, so profoundly correct, that even when the most powerful navy in the world tried to build a competitor, the only thing it managed to produce was a perfect, and very dangerous, illustration of its own failure. The 19th of August, 1942. Dieppe, France. A beach choked with burning tanks and the bodies of 3,000 men. A catastrophic failure. A lesson, paid for in blood, that a fortified port was impregnable. An impossible problem that stalled the entire Allied war effort. The 6th of June, 1944. Normandy, France. A 6-mile front of open, sandy beach. An armada of 5,000 ships. The largest amphibious invasion in human history. A brutal, near-disastrous, but ultimately successful landing. A victory that spelled the end of the Third Reich. The line between these 2 days, between catastrophic failure and strategic triumph, between the impossible problem and the brutal solution, was a 36-foot plywood boat. And the line led back to one man, Andrew Jackson Higgins, the hard-drinking, profane, industrial genius from New Orleans. In the post-war years, he was a global hero. He was the man who won the war, according to the Supreme Allied Commander. He was toasted by admirals, praised by generals, and lauded by President Truman himself, the very man who had once hauled him before a Senate committee on suspicion of profiteering. He had done what the combined industrial might of the established U.S. Navy yards could not. He had solved the problem. He had built the boat. He had given the Allies the key to victory. But the final, profound irony of Andrew Higgins's life is this. He was not a sailor. He was a builder. He was an industrialist. He was a brawler who fought his wars in boardrooms and on factory floors, not on beaches. According to his son, Ed Higgins, and most biographical accounts, Andrew Higgins, the man whose name was synonymous with every major amphibious landing of the war, never set foot on the beaches of Normandy. He never went to Sicily. He never saw firsthand the impossible problem of the Atlantic Wall or the Pacific atolls that his boat, and his boat alone, had been designed to solve. He didn't need to. He had seen the mudflats and cypress stumps of the Louisiana bayou. He had solved that problem, and in doing so, he had given the Allies the tool to solve their own. His fall from grace was as swift and dramatic as his rise. Higgins Industries was a colossus built for a single purpose, to wage total war. His 30,000 workers, his 8 plants, his revolutionary assembly lines all were geared to the insatiable, government-funded demand for landing craft. In August 1945, when Japan surrendered, those contracts worth tens of millions of dollars did not just end. They evaporated overnight. The phone simply stopped ringing. Higgins, the industrial patriot, was now just a civilian contractor with the world's largest, most specialized, and most suddenly obsolete boat-building company. He tried to pivot. He tried to build civilian craft, cargo ships, and even prefabricated housing. But the company was too big, the post-war competition too fierce, and the bureaucratic skills needed to navigate peacetime contracting were not the same as the brawling, defiant genius needed to win a war. The same Washington bureaucracy he had fought, the one he had publicly humiliated, was not inclined to do him any favors. By 1952, the man who had built a new navy every month was dead, and the company that had won the war was bankrupt. His legacy remains complex. He was not a humble man. He was, by all accounts, arrogant, difficult, and prone to volcanic rages. He was a capitalist who made an immense fortune from the war, but he was also an undeniable patriot. He was a progressive who shattered the racial and gender barriers of the segregated South, not from a sense of moral crusade, but from a pragmatic, results-driven need to build the best team. He was a 7th-grade dropout who out-engineered the finest minds in the U.S. Navy. The story of the Higginsboat is the story of its builder. It is a story of stubborn, irreverent American genius. It proves that the Second World War was won not just by the courage of its soldiers, but by the revolutionary, rule-breaking audacity of its civilians. Andrew Higgins was laughed at. He was dismissed by the slide rule boys in Washington. He was investigated by the Senate and sabotaged by his rivals. And while they were all proving on paper why his ideas were impossible, he was in New Orleans, building the boat that would win the war. He was solving the impossible problem, one plywood hull at a time.